Preservation Perspectives, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation podcast. We are commemorating Black History Month in February, and we're excited to have as our guest Dorothy Walker, Site Director of the Freedom Rides Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. The museum is part of the U.S. Civil Rights Trail and also is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Dorothy, there's so much history in Montgomery around the civil rights movement. I remember when I first did research in Montgomery, kind of walking that wide avenue, Dexter Avenue, that kind of leads up to the Capitol. And I will never forget walking on one side of the road, and I think every single block seeing some kind of historical marker. I think sometimes more than one in a block. And not just civil rights, but really from the Revolutionary War period forward and everything in between. And I thought, I've never seen anything like that before. And I said to myself, I'm going to walk on the other side of the street back to the hotel. And it was the same story on that side of the street. And so I think a good way to get started here, I think, is so how does the building where the Freedom Rides Museum fit into this broader history?
Well, thank you all for having us. We're excited to be able to present this information about the Freedom Rides Museum. Montgomery is a historic city, and we figure very prominently the Freedom Rides Museum, the Freedom Rides story, the history of the Freedom Rides figures very prominently, not only in Montgomery's history and Alabama's history, but in American history. We are located in the historic Greyhound Bus Station. The museum itself is located in the bus station downtown. This was Montgomery's first Greyhound bus station, and was built in 1951 as a segregated building. And I think a lot of times when people think about Montgomery's history, they are thinking about the Montgomery bus boycott and the things that happened in Montgomery in 1955 and 56. Well, this building, of course, came along a few years before that event took place. And of course, when it came along in 51, the Supreme Court had already outlawed segregation in interstate travel on the buses, not necessarily in the facilities, but on the buses themselves, in a case that predated the bus boycott case. So Irene Morgan, a young lady in Virginia, had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat to white passengers on a Greyhound bus in 1944. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And then in 1946, the Supreme Court ruled in her favor that segregation of passengers on interstate buses was unconstitutional. And then we had the Congress of Racial Equality had a test ride to see if the interstate buses, which most people think of as Greyhound and Trailways, were the major lines. The Congress of Racial Equality set out on a test ride with a group of volunteers, activists, to see if they would comply. That ride, which predates the Freedom Ride, was called the Journey of Reconciliation. And this year, interestingly enough, 2022 marks the 75th anniversary of the Journey of Reconciliation. So we are looking at a lot of different history even before we get to the Freedom Rides. And of course, 4 years after this building is built, then you have the bus boycott starts and all of the history related to the city buses. And of course, a lot of people come to Montgomery, Luke. We get a lot of visitors to the museum who have this perception that what happened with the Montgomery bus boycott in 55 and 50, when that ended in 56, that it ended segregation on all buses. Well, it only ended the segregation on Montgomery city buses. The interstate buses that were going in and out of this building that you see behind me were still segregated after the boycott ended, because the boycott, the Supreme Court ruling in the boycott only dealt with the segregation of city buses. So even though the segregation on interstate buses had been outlawed a decade before, it was still not being, that federal ruling was not being enforced on the interstate buses. So even in 56, people who locally could ride a city bus on an integrated basis, if they went out of state and used an interstate bus, they still were subject to segregation and still had to sit, Black passengers still had to sit at the back of the bus and still had to use the building on a segregated basis. So we are, for people who haven't been to Montgomery, our museum is located 2 blocks from that historic spot where Mrs. Rosa Parks took her stand in 1955. But there was a lot of history that predated that, related to segregation and transportation. And so in Montgomery, people can get a full range of that prehistory in terms of the journey of reconciliation. And Miss Irene Morgan, who, I'm sorry, her name has kind of been lost to history some, but her stand was just as significant, for sure, in terms of ending segregated travel, in terms of the interstate buses. Her case is the foundational case for the freedom rides later. And so there's all this prehistory that predates the bus boycott, but people coming to Montgomery can get both our history, the boycott history, and then the federal courthouse is right in between both the Freedom Rides Museum, which was the bus station, and the Rosa Parks Museum, which talks about the bus boycott. So there's the legal side of it that people can also get more information about. So there's a lot here that people can explore in terms of the history. And I want to say one note about the legal side. Judge Frank Johnson was a federal judge, and he ruled, one of his rulings in terms of desegregating the city buses that gets appealed to the Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court upholds that ruling. But Frank Johnson is also the one in 1961 who rules in favor of allowing the Freedom Ride to continue. So the fact that we have the federal courthouse that has now been renamed in his honor, sitting really almost smack in the middle between our two sites, is a very interesting position on the landscape here that I don't think a lot of visitors would get when they came to the city. And both the Freedom Rides Museum, the Greyhound Bus Station, and the courthouse are both still in their historic locations, and the historic buildings are still intact for the most part.
And I would add too, for visitors to the city, such walkable locations. I mean, this is a very walkable city. Park the car, get out and see the city. And I'm so glad that you got into some of the history, because I think for a lot of people, if they pay attention to civil rights movement at all, or they can name, one thing or two things, they might think of the '64 Civil Rights Act. They might be able to name Brown versus Board in '54, or integration of Little Rock High School in '57. But as you point out, this was a long, arduous process of desegregation that you can trace back to early in the century, when it's federal government workers, unions, and then the military during World War II.
That's
and
right.
So this is, I think too many Americans think, well, wasn't that over with, Brown versus Board or Civil Rights Act? No, that was the beginning of a very long process that took generations.
That's right.
And so I'm glad you got into some of the details there. But I think it bears repeating also, your museum is in a bus station. And the bus station, that was the center of the events that you're speaking of. So how do you preserve a building like that?
Well, I would like to say too, also that the bus station, the museum is operated by the Alabama Historical Commission, which is the State Historic Preservation Office. And how we got involved in this project was when Greyhound moved out of this facility, the building was built as segregated in '51. Due to the courageous actions of the Freedom Riders in '61, the federal government had ordered that these bus station terminals, train stations, airports, all of these stations and their respective modes of transportation be desegregated. However, the folks who managed our building here in Montgomery were a little slow to act. So we don't get a integrated facility for another 7 years post that decision in '61. But in '68, Greyhound reconfigures the building for integration, and they create this huge facility here. It was massive. It went all the way to the next block. And it was a huge operation that stayed here for nearly 30 years. And then Greyhound moved out in the early '90s. When they left the facility, and the reason they left is because, quite frankly, there were a lot more buildings downtown around us at that time, and they were landlocked. They couldn't get any more space. So they decided, well, we'll build something outside of town, outside of downtown, and they abandoned this facility. The General Services Administration that maintains the federal courthouse purchased the property. And for those of folks who can see the big, huge expansion onto the courthouse behind us, that project was in progress, and their intent General Service GSA's intent was to demolish the entire facility, where, well, the State Historic Preservation Office intervened and got involved and rallied people within the community, local folks, prominent individuals, even judges in the Middle District of the courthouse, and said, you know, this is an important place in American history. It was a turning point in the civil rights movement. There should be a way that we can compromise and save some portion of this building for this story. And so that's what happened. We got involved and we rallied and we saved at least 2/3 of the building, and then turned it, restored it to its 1961 appearance. So when people come, the Greyhound sign is still very prominent on the building, but and that sometimes throws people off because they think it's a bus station. And because it's not that long ago that Greyhound moved out, we still get people coming by this facility with their luggage, trying to take a bus, and we are constantly having to tell them, don't let your ride leave you. You're not at the bus station. But we're glad that people still recognize the Greyhound insignia and the branding on it. And Greyhound did, because Greyhound had upgraded their branding over the years, in those almost 30 years out when they integrated the building, we did get them. They were very generous in donating the historic signage back to the building. The Greyhound sign and the running dog. So those are, while they're not original to this facility, they are original to the period of the Freedom Rides. And so we were able to restore that exterior to what it looked like in the early 1960s. We did such a good job of restoring it as a bus station that people still think that it's a bus station. And it is very important to us that we were able to save the space where the history happened, of course, in 1961.
Well, you talked about one of the more prominent features of the building being the sign out front there. What are some of the other unique elements and features of the building that visitors see?
Well, on the exterior, when people come up to our building, one of the things they're going to see is that there's the main entrance doors, which were the main entrance in 1951 when the building was built as well. It's a double glass door entrance recessed under a canopy and under a marquee. And that's the way it was in 1951 and in 1961 when the Freedom Riders arrived. But what visitors will also see is a blocked up entrance just beyond that double door main entrance. And that was formerly the segregated entrance for Black passengers. And of course, we tell our visitors all the time, one of the things we do in terms of our interpretation of this building, of this place, of this history, is we're using the authentic terminology from the period. So that entrance was not called the entrance for Black passengers. It was called the colored entrance at the time. So that is a term that was used at that time. And in fact, for visitors who come to the building, there are holes in the brick above the blocked up entrance now that once held those letters that said colored entrance. And so that's a really unique feature. It's interesting that Greyhound didn't take it out when they no longer needed it. They tiled it up. And so it still stands out as the entrance. The other deceptive part about that is that we get to interpret inside the building is when Black passengers came through that colored entrance in when this building was segregated, they were, even though it said entrance outside, they were not inside the facility. That entrance led outside to the bus platform area. And then Black passengers had to walk all the way to the rear of the building to get into the segregated space at the back of the building. So we debated, and when I say we, the Alabama Historical Commission, when we were working to restore the facade of this building, we debated about whether or not to put that sign back up. I mean, there was some vigorous discussions about whether to put colored entrance back up there. But we ultimately decided that what the Freedom Riders were fighting for is that there would be one entrance for all passengers, and that segregated entrance would not be prominent. And we thought, with all of their sacrifice, and the fact that they had won a victory by having that sign, those segregated signs come down, that even for the sake of interpreting the space, we didn't think it appropriate to put it back. However, on the interior of the building, we do interpret it. We do have information that says that this was formerly the colored entrance, but it's no longer an entrance anymore. Greyhound blocked it up in '68 when they integrated the building. And then they walled it in on the inside. So this wall on the inside, when you were in the building in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you couldn't tell that that was there was something behind that wall because it was just a wall. But when the agency got access to the building, we leased it from the General Services Administration. When we got access to the building, we got permission to open up that wall. And also on the inside, you can see the blocked up area as well. So that we thought that was very prominent. And Luke, I've had people who come to this building, to the museum, who lived during the period of segregation and stand at that wall and weep because remembering what that was like to be treated as a second-class citizens, even though they were paying the same fare. So it's a prominent space within the museum itself. The other feature we have remaining on the interior of the building is when Greyhound integrated the facility in the late 1960s, they created new bathrooms for all passengers. So they were just separated by men and women. And we were able to save those bathrooms in their original configuration that Greyhound put them in '68 when the demolition occurred on part of the building. So we still have our historic bathrooms as well. So people walk into our bathrooms with those 1960s tile colors, particularly in the women's bathroom, that's Pepto-Bismol pink, as I like to refer to it. And they are very taken aback. They feel like they walked back in time into a space. And they always comment as well that, well, you have such big bathrooms for such a small facility. Well, it was for a much larger bus station at the time, but it's great that we still have those historic elements. And we also have the original tile on the floors from when the building was constructed in 1951. So we have a lot of features, architectural features that we interpret to visitors. Part of the reason why we do that, and we're probably one of the few facilities, museums that people go into where the architecture of the building is what we interpret first, because it is the context for the movement. And we call it the architecture of segregation, which a lot of people don't think of much about. They think about the segregated signs, the colored and the white signs, but they don't think about that, in some cases like ours, Greyhound hired a professional architect to sit and develop these spaces that would create an experience for one set of passengers that was different from another set of passengers. And we were very fortunate to have copies of those original blueprints that architect did. So we have that on display in the museum as well.
Well, my hat's off to you. I mean, you deserve a lot of credit for maintaining so many of those historic elements. As you were telling those stories about those tough decisions, I thought, what an interesting example that so many historic sites now across the country, struggle with, well, how do we maintain these sites? How do we present this historical content for future generations? And the way that you've maintained so many historic elements in terms of the visitor experience really makes a site come alive. It's no longer just something you read about, but something really a sort of a sensory experience that the visitors can really immerse themselves in. And so you've talked a little bit about the building, the architecture, what it would have been like for passengers, but how did the idea of the museum come about in the space?
Well, when the Alabama Historical Commission was able to successfully rally community members and to convince General Services Administration to leave a portion of the building, then, as the State Historic Preservation Office, we operate almost a dozen sites across the state, in addition to this one. And so operating a historic place and interpreting the story and the history there is something that falls within our mission. So we thought this would be a great place to do that. So we worked with the General Services Administration. Like I said, we entered into a lease, and then we set about restoring the exterior of the building to at least as much of the period from its period of significance as we could. And then, of course, after that, in 2008, that was in the early 2000s when we entered the lease with GSA. But in 2008, we still didn't have the funding to do the museum inside. But what we were able to do is to get some funding to put an exhibit on the exterior of the building, because we feared that if we never got the funds to do the museum, there would at least be something there that would tell people the story of what happened there and why this place mattered, why it was important. So we unveiled that in 2008 with a number of freedom riders in attendance with us who have since passed on, unfortunately. And then in 2011, we were able to, between 2008 and 2011, able to get enough funding to open the museum. And 2011 was significant because it was the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. So we were very fortunate that we were able to open the museum. The museum tells the overarching story of the Freedom Rides, but then it emphasizes the role of the building and the place in Montgomery and the events that happened there. So we were very fortunate to be able to do that. And then 2021, last year, was the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Rides and the 10th anniversary of the museum opening. So we have, for 10 years, over 10 years, we've been here telling this story. And we also wrestled with, at the time when we were thinking about opening the museum, at the time in the early 2000s, there was not another place in the country that was exclusively focusing on the Freedom Rides story and the Freedom Rides history. And we wrestled with the idea of calling this the National Freedom Rides Museum. But we felt like this story, it being such a linear story, it didn't start in Montgomery and it didn't end in Montgomery. We felt like we wanted to be a place to tell the story, but not the place. That it is a place that people could come and get a lot of the history, but also visit the other sites, both within the city of Montgomery, within the state of Alabama, but then in other areas, starting in DC and going on to New Orleans, that also embodied that history. So we're pretty fortunate that we get to operate the museum out of this space. I will tell you that one of the things we tell our visitors is, we could have done a museum anywhere. We could have done a museum even online. And people don't come to Montgomery because they're learning history. You can learn history anywhere. They're coming to Montgomery so they can experience the places. And we got involved in this because we didn't get involved in this to create a museum. We got involved in this to save the place where the history happened. But we felt it was important to put part of the story in it as well. And the other thing that makes us unique in the city of Montgomery with all the museums is that I tell people all the time, I'm very honored to work for the state of Alabama, because the state of Alabama is putting funding into a facility and it's paying us as staff to tell visitors what the state of Alabama did not do in terms of protecting people's constitutional right to travel 60-something years ago. And that shows us how far we've come, that the state government is paying people to tell other people that the state of Alabama did not live up to its end in the early 1960s of protecting these folks' constitutional right to travel. But that just shows you how far we've come along. And that makes me very proud to be associated with the state of Alabama, that we have progressed to that point.
I say, while listening to you, you must get some powerful visitor feedback at times. And I'd be curious to know, from visitors' perspectives, why is it important to tell this story the way you do, in this building that you've preserved?
I think visitors really find that hearing more about the story and the history in a place where a part of it occurred really makes it much more of a real experience for them. I mean, part of the bus platform where the attack occurred on the Freedom Riders in 1961 is still there. And so when we're telling them that we're standing outside where the bus is parked, we're also telling them that we're standing on the spot where Freedom Riders were attacked and beaten and bled. So it's not just a space anymore. It becomes hollowed ground. And people react differently going through the space, knowing that it was the actual bus station. Inside the facility, we have the floors that were part of the building originally in 51 when it was built, that were for white passengers only. And we tell visitors that, particularly when we have a diverse group of people who come together, we tell them that, 61 years ago, we would not be able to be in that space, standing on those floors together. And for some people, that arc of time, particularly young people, 60 years ago seems like a long time, but we all know that it's not that long ago. And it just being in that space reminds us that, we have an obligation to continue to tell this story, and to keep this place alive, especially considering that we are in the process of, over the last 2 decades, of losing the people who were involved in this. And so it becomes even more critical that we tell this story. And so visitors react they have a very visceral, like you said, experience when they're there in the museum, knowing that they're not just in a museum, they're in the place where the history occurred. And I think that just makes it immerses them into the story a little bit deeper.
It's a great point. I was going to ask you, the preservation of the building into a museum was honored by the ACHP and National Trust for Historic Preservation with the Federal Partnerships and Historic Preservation Award in 2012. This related to a partnership between the Alabama Historical Commission and the Federal General Services Administration, which you've already mentioned. Can you tell us a little more about that partnership?
Yes, like I said, the Alabama Historical Commission leases the building from the General Services Administration, but they are really good partners for us. Whenever our signage out on the exterior, particularly when it was still in its, because it's an original neon sign with the original technology for neon in it, which means that there were times when it would go out, and the General Services Administration would always, come and make sure that that sign was repaired. Whenever the roof leaks in the building, and it leaks a lot because it's a flat roof, they are right on top of it. But they also provide, some level of security for the building. But in working with them, the building itself, because of the demolition that occurred in the late 1990s, we only have, about 2,700 square feet of building to tell the story and to do programming. So there are times when we have to rely on the General Services Administration and the federal courthouse to have programs, especially during major anniversary years, like when we opened in 2011 and in 2021 for the 60th anniversary. They are very generous with us to allow us to use portions of the courthouse to have programming, or to work with us in closing off the street. And it's a very, it's a federal courthouse, so it's a very secure location. So anytime we want to have any kind of programming there, they work very well with us and making sure that we have everything we need, that the facility is secure. And again, any maintenance issues that we have, they're very willing to work with us. They've extended our lease even though we lease this for a very, very nominal amount. We have a very close working relationship with them. So it's a great partnership that has endured over these last really over the last 20 years, because we entered into the lease 10 years before we opened the museum.
Well, and since our occasion for talking here is Black History Month, do you have any events coming up there, either for the month or coming up in the near future, for those visitors hoping to pay you a visit sooner rather than later?
Well, I will tell you that we just actually this week just had an event on yesterday. Yesterday was President's Day to a lot of people across the country, but yesterday also intertwined this year with the birthday of the late Congressman John Lewis. And so we took the opportunity to talk about two Johns, Congressman John Lewis and President John F. Kennedy, who was president during the Freedom Rides. We actually could have thrown in a third John if I had thought about it, because the governor at the time was John Patterson.
Yep.
And so we could have really had a whole day full of Johns. But we are, so we had an interesting dialogue, which we'll be posting on our Facebook page, with the Pulitzer Prize winning historian, Dr. Taylor Branch, and we were really enlightened about his comments and his research, and he knew Congressman Lewis very well. He's written, of course, about presidents, Kennedy and his administration. So, but in the near future, in April, there will be a play that the Alabama Shakespeare Festival is presenting on the Freedom Rise. And so we're going to be partnering with them on some programming. So we'll be doing some special kinds of programs throughout the year. And one of the things I'd also like your visitors to know is that last year for the 60th anniversary, we unveiled, which is one of the coolest artifacts for any museum. We unveiled a vintage Greyhound bus from the period of the Freedom Rise, and it's been completely restored. And we are very excited to have that as an addition to the museum because, hey, we're a bus station. We need a bus. So now we have a bus that we can take across the country, and it's a mobile extension of the museum. So we have, a number of things that we're trying to do to immerse people in this story. We have artifacts from that are replicas of some of the things that the members of the mob used to attack the Freedom Riders with. So when it comes to the museum, we have a Coca-Cola crate that's the same vintage of the one that Congressman Lewis was attacked with. We have bricks, and we're hoping to continue to gather additional artifacts that we have not to glorify the violence, of course, but to also to show the courage of the Freedom Riders to withstand the violence and still remain committed to nonviolence in an effort to change things. So we are constantly on the, and of course this year being the 75th anniversary of the Journey of Reconciliation, in April we'll be doing a number of events around that as well. So we're pretty excited about all the things that we're doing and that are coming up, and we look forward to people visiting, and we've had lots of folks visiting, and people seem to be getting more comfortable visiting again. So we do group tours, but we also do just sort of walk-in visitors across the world. People are coming, and we're excited by that.
That's great. You've really got a special site there. And you mentioned your website. So I always like to leave viewers with a call to action. How can they learn more? How can they get involved? How can they support you? What are the steps they could take?
Well, the best way to get us, of course, is on our website. So it's www.ahc.alabama.gov, and that's our agency website. But on there's a page for the Freedom Rise Museum, and so people can get there, but they also can follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page. It's the Freedom Rise Museum, and so we are excited that people can connect with us in different ways to get more information. They can call the museum, and of course, visit the site. We are located in downtown Montgomery. A lot of people miss us because they think we're a bus station, but we are the museum. And so we hope people will come out and visit with us or connect with us online, and they can book a tour through our website as well. So.
Well, now that you have a restored bus, you're really going to confuse them.
Well, maybe.
No, I've seen a couple of these. I think Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh had one for a while, and the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan had one. And especially as a teaching tool, to teach people about sort of the floating color line and all that. I mean, to sit in the seats, again, I think it's just one more part of your visitor experience that's just so powerful. And it's so much more meaningful to experience it sort of in the flesh than to read about it.
That's really right, because at the foundation of this story is the ability to travel freely as American citizens. And we tell people all the time, it's one thing for us, we all travel. Everybody travels, even if it's just within your own community, across the city. But we all travel, and the ability to be able to move about freely, and as it's enshrined in our Constitution for us to have that right. And so we want people to recognize that that was a hard-fought battle for people to get that right restored to all Americans, and this place played a role in it. And but when people are on that bus, like you said, it's the same thing for us, right? And today, as we try to travel as Americans, we can talk about going someplace, and it doesn't really become real until we pack a suitcase. And then once we pack the suitcase, it's still not really, we're not on a journey until we actually get underway. And it's the same thing with the Freedom Riders. When they got on those buses 61 years ago, it was, they didn't know what awaited them when they got off. And so to be on the bus and have that contemplation and that understanding of, it's a very powerful thing to be a part of. And the main thing I do want people to know that the Freedom Riders weren't just pushing for segregation to end on buses, interstate buses, but also on passenger trains, as well as on airplanes. And that's the thing that people really don't think about when they think about this period of segregation, is that about the airports and air travel and how that was segregated. And we talk about all those forms of transportation at the bus station. So there's a lot to be learned, and we hope that people take it all in stride. And there's a great documentary that PBS did that's on the website. So PBS, if you go to PBS and their American Experience series, there's a great documentary on the Freedom Rides.
Well, I think you said it best. Hallowed ground is what we're talking about. So I think that's a great place to wrap up. And thank you so much, Dorothy, for taking some of your time out of your day and speaking with me about the Freedom Rides Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. If in Montgomery, you've got a lot of competition to fill your day with history sites, but be sure and stop in and learn more about the site, and follow the ACHP social media channels for information about African American historic sites and how to visit them to get more details on the contributions of African Americans to this nation's history. I'm Luke Nichter, and this is Preservation Perspectives.